Welcome, everybody. I'm Wanda Pitsley, president of the Central Great Lakes region of Women's League for Conservative Judaism. This is going to be very short and sweet. I simply want to acknowledge the committee that is responsible for putting this program together. From CGLR, besides myself, we have Esther Javits, who's Israel chair, Pam Schlossberg, the immediate past president, and Linda Wolf, who is the past Israel chair. We also have from the U.S. Rabbi Sharon Marcus of Park Synagogue. In Israel, from Hod Hadar, we have Elizabeth Guth, Leslie Radner, Rabbi Judith Edelman-Green, Rabbi Helaine Ettinger, and we have also with us Diane Friedgood. And I'd also like to acknowledge Julia Loeb, our CGLR president. The whole purpose of this series of programs that we've done is to foster friendships and understanding between the Mizorti women in Israel and the conservative women in the U.S. through conversations and mutually agreed upon programming. I'm going to turn it over now to Esther Javits.
Welcome all. The purpose of our getting together Jewish women from two countries is to listen to each other, trying to understand and maybe one day engage in some mutual project together. Let me just please shortly outline the program of today. Rabbi Judith is going to introduce the speaker. Then Ms. Elana Kaminka will have her presentation. We will follow up with Q&A or comments, and please raise your electronic hand or put it in the chat. We would like also to hear from Rabbi Sharon on her visit with her members in Israel, and we will conclude with a prayer by Rabbi Helaine, and the text is going to be displayed for you. So please stay muted till you are called. And let's enjoy the program. And Rabbi Judith, please.
Erev Tov, good evening, friends from all over the world. I remember meeting Elana when she was a young woman, and I was so impressed how she made Aliyah at a young age, and how her Hebrew was so much better than mine, even though she just showed up on the scene. She married Ayal Kaminka, whose entire family are founding members of Hod Vadar. Nahum and Shlomit built the building, literally, and all four of their sons had bar mitzvahs at Hod Vadar. And Elana's son Yanai was named at Hod Vadar, and I was privileged to be part of that and was very moved at the time, as I was to see my young friend Elana become the mother of 4 children herself. And I think originally from Davis, California, and many, many years from Israel. And I think it's just best to hear from you yourself, Elana. Welcome.
Thank you. So I want to start by a couple of apologies. First of all, in the introduction, you said you hope you enjoy the program, and unfortunately, I don't think you're going to enjoy it per se, because it's a heavy topic. And so if anyone feels that it's too much for them or they want to step out, it's fine. I won't take it personally, but I am going to speak to you today about my son, who we lost on October 7th. And hopefully afterwards, if you have questions or anything you want to ask, I'm happy to answer. So if it's okay with you, I'll just dive in. I'm going to share my screen so you'll be able to see some pictures and get to know you and I a little bit better. So just give me a second to connect the PowerPoint. So this is my son Yanai. Before I start telling you anything about him, I always start by apologizing to him, because one of the things that he really didn't like was being in center stage. He was a very private person, a very, I don't know if he was an introvert per se, but somebody who liked to hold his cards close to his chest and didn't like to share things about himself. And for us as parents, it was really a dilemma. How much do we share about him? What is it? What do we have the prerogative to say about him and to share about his story when he's not here to approve or disapprove of whatever we're saying? So I want to start off by apologizing to him if anything I say is not something that he would agree with or approve of. The night of October 7th, when we found out that Yanai had been killed, we were one of the first families to get the message. One of the first things that my husband and I promised to one another is that we didn't want Yanai's life story to be the last hour and a half of his life. He was alive for almost 21 years. He was killed 3 weeks before his 21st birthday. And in our minds, those 20 years are much more important than the last hour and a half. And we didn't want that to be the focus of what was told about him. And the other thing we were very worried about is Israelis, especially now in the time of war, have a tendency to talk about people who were killed in the army in terms of heroism. And the word hero was very problematic to us because, first of all, it's a very flat word. It doesn't tell you anything about who Yanai was as a person. He was a full person with many facets to his being and his personality, and you don't hear any of that when you use the word hero. And also, there's definitely a romanticization of death in Israel, of the idea that it's good to die for your country, and we're very much opposed to that idea. It's not good to die for your country, it's good to live for your country. And the fact that our young people are dying is not something to be proud of or happy about, but something that we very much oppose. So I'll start off by putting out those caveats. I will tell you a bit about what happened on October 7th, because unfortunately, a year and 3 months later, we're still living in the context of a war that's going on in Israel. And Yanai was killed within that context. He didn't die in a car accident or something unrelated. So I will speak about it briefly, but the main focus will be on Yanai and who he was as an individual and his ethos of leadership, which I think was very unique for someone his age. So just a word before we dive into October 7th. Like I told you, Yanai was very private, very personal, really didn't like to be on center stage. And a lot of the pictures we have of him look like these two. He was always trying to avoid the spotlight, have turned the camera to someone else. Both of these pictures were taken in the year that he did a year of civilian service after high school, before joining the army. In Israel, a lot of young people, in addition to the military service that they're required to do, choose to do another year of civilian service. It's not instead, it's in addition to. And Yanai chose to do that type of year. He graduated high school in 2020, and he joined the civil service. He worked with at-risk youth near Haifa, and in the morning in a school, and in the afternoon in an after-school activity. And he did that for a full year, and he was drafted in August of 2021. He was drafted to a unit that is actually associated with the Israel Home Front Command. It's a unit that's tasked with protecting Israel's civilians and helping civilians in extreme situations. So I'm sure some of you have seen Israeli delegations being sent out to earthquakes or to natural disasters, or the condo in Miami that collapsed. And Yanai was part of the unit that's their expertise. So they also do ongoing patrolling and other military activities, but their special expertise is search and rescue of civilians in all kinds of disaster situations. This is a picture of Yanai when he was in his training. He never saw this picture. It was taken by a military photographer, but we feel comfortable showing it because it's kind of, he looks pretty cool in the picture, and we think he would have liked it. This was in his officer's training. He's, like I said, started the army in August 2021. He went through a 9-month training period in this unit to become a trained soldier of the search and rescue unit of the Home Front Command. He right away went to commander's course and then came back, and he was a squad commander for new recruits in that unit. So after he was trained as a commander, he went back to work with the new recruits. He always was very attracted to, or very drawn to, educational tasks. He was a leader in scouts in high school and in the army as well. He really liked the idea of working with the new recruits and helping them develop their character and helping shape them. That was something that really appealed to him. When he was in the middle of of working with this new group of recruits, he was sent to officer school. This picture is from his training in officer school, and in July of 2023, he became an officer. And as always, his heart was with training, with the educational aspects of the army, training the new recruits, and he asked to go back to work with new recruits, this time as an officer. And that's where he was on the Shabbat of October 7th. His trainees were only drafted in the middle of August, which means that on that Shabbat, they'd been in the army for about 6 weeks. So super new, zero experience. It was actually the first time that they'd been left on base to do guard duty, because before that time, they hadn't even really learned to use their weapons properly. So they weren't certified to guard the base. That was the first weekend that they were allowed to guard. The base where he served is, if you can imagine, Gaza looks kind of like a rectangle. And his base is in a place called Zikim, which is on the very north side of Gaza, facing the Mediterranean Sea. So if any of you have been to Ashkelon, kind of on the southern coast of Israel, it's a little bit further south towards the border with Gaza, on the coastline, right to the north of Gaza. And that's where Yanai was. His base normally has hundreds of soldiers because they train many different kinds of units in search and rescue activity in the base. But on that weekend, because it was a holiday and it was a weekend, the army let everyone go. Although normally there's at least 2 companies on base at all times, that Shabbat, there was only 1 company. And again, completely composed of these new recruits who'd just been drafted 6 weeks earlier and really had no experience. At 6:29 on the morning of October 7th, the base, like many places in Israel, was hit by a massive artillery barrage. You can see this is a picture that was published in the press. The army told us that they found about 35 missile heads within the perimeter of the base. So that actual missiles that had fallen within the perimeter of the base, setting fire to foliage, like you can see in the picture. And Yanai and all the other soldiers who were at the base, according to protocol, ran into bomb shelters, because that's what they were supposed to do in times of attack. The only people who were not in the bomb shelters were some of his trainees who were standing guard at that time at the various posts around the perimeter of the base. So there's about 7 or 8 different guard posts around the perimeter, and trainees were in those posts when the attack began. Yanai was one of 5 officers on the base, all ages 20 to 22. And they right away, as they got to the bomb shelter, consulted on how they should proceed. And they began to hear shooting outside. And they realized very quickly that this wasn't a regular attack, that this was something more extreme than they were used to, being near Gaza. And that the new trainees who had just been drafted into the army 6 weeks earlier simply didn't have the capacity to deal with such an extreme situation. Unfortunately, their superiors hadn't realized that beforehand, but it was clear to Yanai and the other officers as soon as the attack started. And they made a split decision. Again, this group of 5 20 to 22-year-olds, they made the decision that they were going to set out and replace the trainees at all the posts around the perimeter of the base and send the trainees back to safety, because it was their responsibility. They were in charge. And that's what they did. The 5 officers and a group of about 12 sergeants who were on base split up and ran out to all the different posts around the perimeter of the base and sent the trainees back to safety in the bomb shelters. We didn't know a lot about what happened to Yanai, where he'd gone first. The first we heard about it was during the Shiva, when the father of one of the trainees came to thank us for his daughter's life. And he told us that his daughter, when the attack started, had been at a post facing the sea, facing the Mediterranean Sea. So like I told you, the base was on the border of Gaza facing the Mediterranean, and she had been at the post that faced westward towards the Mediterranean Sea. And she was an 18-year-old, 6 weeks in the army, and she came under massive attack. And the first thing that she did was she called her dad, and she started to cry. And she told her dad, you know, I can hear bombs falling all over. I can hear people shooting. She couldn't see any of the Hamas attackers because there's a lot of foliage, but she could hear shooting. And she called her dad crying. Her dad told us that while he was on the phone with her, he could hear Yanai and the other sergeants show up and tell her to fall back to safety, and that they were taking over for her. The second thing we heard about Yanai on that day in that post was about 3 weeks after he was killed, when a civilian who'd been on the beach shared a post on Instagram. The civilian, whose name is Ariel, had been at a party on the beach, having fun, hanging out, getting drunk, slept over on the beach. And when the attack started, he was with his friends still sleeping on the beach. And he wrote a post explaining what happened from his perspective, and I'd like to read you bits of it. This is what Ariel wrote. He wrote, "The staff at the bar where I work went out for the evening. We danced and had fun and camped out on the Zikim beach. We woke up in the morning to sounds of explosions and sirens and took shelter among the tanks. We felt relatively safe there. We assumed we would stay there in the next few hours until everything calms down, until it's all over. Until boats with dozens of terrorists emerge from the sea, armed from head to toe with every type of weapon you can imagine, ones that give you nightmares just from the thought of how they're used." He explains in his post, we cut out this part, how he called the police, they called the army, they called everyone they could think of, and no one answered them. There was no one to respond, no one to give any kind of support that there was someone on the way to help them. He continues and writes, "At that moment, we were abandoned. No one knew we were there. No rescue team was on the way. All that was left was to sit quietly and pray. And believe me, we prayed. Apparently, someone heard us because not 10 minutes had passed when soldiers came to the gate of the base. They approached us under fire, taking out terrorists as they advanced in our direction. Second Lieutenant Yanai Kaminka, the officer, Sergeant Yariv, and Sergeant Helaine. I remember the feeling of relief that washed over me. For a moment, I even thought I was imagining it. Harel evacuated the basic trainee, and we were left with Yariv and Yanai. Yanai came to brief us. Professional, cool, as if he hadn't heard the reports of fatalities. Connecting with us as if they hadn't been fired upon 3 minutes earlier. They stayed with us and assured us that we would be fine, that the IDF had come to protect us. I can tell you from the bottom of my heart, when Yanai said it, I believed him. They fired on all sides like pros to give us cover, stood guard with a kind of madness in their eyes, madness that said, terrorists aren't allowed here. And so it was for 10 wonderful and terrible minutes. Wonderful because I really felt that terrorists would not be able to get to us there. And terrible because only those who were listening to an IDF radio during those minutes can understand what really happened. And apparently it was a little too much for Yanai. He briefed Yariv and asked him to watch over us. Only Yanai could tell you what made him leave everything and run amok into the hellfire. But if you ask me, his friends' desperate voices over the radio were why he did it without saying goodbye. Without thinking, he just took off and ran to save his friends. So Ariel didn't know what made Yanai leave the post, but actually we did know, because at some point the army radio completely stopped working and the entire battle was conducted over the staff WhatsApp group. So we had the screenshots of what they were saying. And what happened is that Yanai was at the post facing west, but there were 2 posts in the base that were facing south, directly towards Gaza. And in between the perimeter of the base and Gaza was about 700 yards of open space. It was the area where the soldiers usually did their training exercises. The Hamas had blown 2 holes in the fence and had come through that open area and attacked the southern facing posts of the base. At one of those posts, there was a sharpshooter. He wounded several of Yanai's friends and also killed two of them, the company commander, Adir Abudi, and his deputy, Or Moses. And at the second post, one of Yanai's friends, a young woman by the name of Adal Ben Simon, who had been with him in officer school, was at the post together with one of the commanders who worked under Yanai in his platoon. You can see here in the picture Yanai with his platoon staff, with his subordinates. The one who's standing right to his left, standing to his left, the shorter woman, she was at the post that was under the heavy attack. And both she and Adal wrote that they needed reinforcements, basically begged for reinforcements many times. They were running out of ammunition and they needed help. At some point, Noah, the one who's on the far right in the black shirt, she decided that she would take it upon herself and ran to the post to help them. But on the way, the sharpshooter hit her. She was hit in the head and lost consciousness. The only good part of the story is that she actually survived, and other than the fact she lost an eye, she's actually okay today. But at that point, she was unconscious, and the people in the post kept asking for help and for reinforcements. At some point, Yanai made the decision. It was his decision. No one gave him an order. He just made the assessment that what was in his post, things were fairly under control, and that the civilians that he'd helped were safe. And he decided that he was going to leave his post and run and help Adal and the other people at the post that was under such heavy fire. He ran to that post. He evacuated the young woman who's standing next to him, who she'd been injured, a light injury, but she was bleeding and she was very stressed out. He evacuated her and came into the reinforced post and took over her position. And for about a half an hour, he and Adal and two other soldiers fought off a group of cell of Hamas. At the very end, they simply ran out of ammunition, and that's why they weren't able to continue fighting. The last messages that we have from the posts are, you can see them here from the WhatsApp group at 8:09. One of the people, Yanai didn't write, he was focused on fighting, but one of the other women there wrote at 8:09, they have grenades, we need reinforcement. Somebody else would go to, it's urgent, go there. 8:10, we're almost out of bullets. 8:10, reinforcements urgently in the shooting ranges. 8:11, there are terrorists here. Reinforcements, we need help. 8:11, in the shooting range. 8:12, we're out of ammunition. And at 8:13, the same soldier wrote, injured with mistakes. And that was the last that was heard from the post. From the Army investigation, we know that a rocket-propelled grenade was shot at their post, in addition to several other grenades, and most likely that killed all four of them at once, because they found them slightly back from the post itself. So that was what happened to Yanai on that day. The aftermath of what happened in the base where he was is that the company had 7 casualties, among them 6 commanders and 1 trainee. 4 of the 5 officers who fought in the battle were killed, but over 100 trainees who were in the base and the bomb shelters were saved. About 30 civilians, Ariel and his friends and some other civilians who'd taken refuge, were saved. And the 2 kibbutzim that are immediately adjacent to his base, Kibbutz Zikim and Kibbutz Kalmia, there were no casualties at either one of those kibbutzim, unlike what happened in many of the other kibbutzim in the Gaza envelope, because the people in the kibbutzes in that area simply had time. They heard the battle, they understood that something was happening, and they had time to prepare, to lock their gates, to get their security forces ready, and those kibbutzes were saved without any loss of life and any casualties. So that's what happened to Yanai on October 7th. But like I promised you, that's not what I want to talk about. I want to tell you about Yanai, who he was as an individual and as a person. And that's what I feel is more important. So here you see a couple of pictures of Yanai. The one on the left is how he usually looked He liked to kind of be sitting on the side and observing other people. We used to say he had X-ray eyes. He was always very interested in analyzing other people, trying to figure out how their minds work, how they perceive the world, what the group dynamics are around him, really analyzing his surroundings and trying to make sense of them. Like I said at the beginning, he didn't like to be on center stage, and it was a challenge for us as his parents, because we would see that there were shows at the end of first grade, class plays or class shows, and he didn't want to be on stage. And sometimes we were a bit worried that maybe he has some kind of social problems, but we very quickly saw that he definitely did not have social problems. He had a lot of friends, a lot of close friends. People liked to hear his advice and consult with him. He just simply liked to do it in his own way, one-on-one, and not being in front of other people, but rather observing them, listening to them, talking to them, and getting to know them. I'll give you an example of how that worked for him in many cases. When he started his year of civil service after high school, it was, like I said, it was in 2020. It was the height of COVID. So before he and his friends joined the program, they had never met each other, only on Zoom, like we're speaking now. And they showed up for the first day of the program, and they were essentially strangers that they were going to spend the entire year together, living together and working together. And one of the young women who was on the program with him told us that she walked into the room and she looked at all the other people and her heart just sunk. And she said, I felt like I'd made the worst mistake of my life. These people are not my cup of tea. I don't know what I'm doing here. I should have never joined the civil service, and I have to quit this program right away because it's just not for me. And she said everyone was hanging out and having a party that night, but she just felt completely disconnected. And she stepped out and went and sat down by herself outside. And she said it didn't take more than a minute or two when somebody showed up and sat down next to her. For her, he was a stranger. He was just as unknown as all the rest of the people in the group, but it was Yanai. And he asked her, how are you doing? How are you? And she said what everyone says, fine. And he said, you're a liar. I don't believe you. And she told us that after 3 hours, when she poured her heart out to him and told him everything she was feeling and everything that was going through her mind, she felt a lot more connected. And she went back to the group, and she ended up completing the year of civil service with Yanai, because he connected. He allowed her to feel like she wasn't completely alone and connected in the world. And we heard hundreds of stories like that with how he connected with other people, but again, not by doing it in front of a group, but by finding the person who needed an ear and lending them that ear and giving them the opportunity, or giving them the sense that someone saw them and wanted to hear them and where they were. For us as parents, he did the same. Oftentimes we'd say to him, Yanai, how are you? And he'd say, Mom, how are you? Tell me about what's going on with you instead. He'd always turn it around to the other side. And that was a challenge for us, because a lot of times as parents, we'd feel like something was going on with him, and it was hard to pull it out of him and know exactly what was going through his mind and what he was thinking. One of the ways he expressed himself was through music. Of our 4 children, he's the only one who refused to take formal music lessons at any time, but he taught himself how to play, mostly piano, some guitar, and he taught himself completely on his own, and completely self-taught, by listening to YouTube videos, by asking people for assistance and for help, and he just would sit and play. He never knew how to read music. He couldn't read notes, but he could listen to almost any type of music and sit down at the piano and play it. He really liked, I don't know if any of you are musicians, but he liked music that sat somewhere on the connection between major and minor chords, that music that was sort of happy, but also left you with a sense of something very deep and emotional. And that's the tension he would play on. We have very few recordings of him playing music because as soon as we would try to record him, he would stop playing because then it became a performance and he was not interested in performing. And we have a couple. I won't play it today because it doesn't come through well on Zoom, but I can tell you that his playing was really extraordinary, and it's one of the sad things that we don't have more documentation of his music. The other thing that was very, very clear about who Yanai was is that he had an ethos of leadership. He had an idea in his mind of what it meant to be a leader. And again, he was killed. He wasn't even 21 years old, but he really thought it through, and it was a well thought through ethos of how one should lead other people. I don't know how many of you have worked in organizations or in a company where there's kind of a slogan of what the company's values are, but there's a huge gap between what's written in the slogan and how you actually feel as a worker or an employee in that organization. I think most of us have experienced that gap and how frustrating it can be. Yanai wrote about his leadership philosophy, but I can tell you he didn't only write about it, he also lived it, because he didn't believe in those kind of empty slogans. He believed that anything that he took upon himself, it wasn't enough to write about it. He had to make sure that it was what he did on a daily basis. After he was killed, we found a document that he'd written while in officers training. He'd been asked to write down his leadership values as an officer, and these are his words that we found that he wrote. The first value that he wrote, and again, this is in the military, so I don't know if any of you were in the military, but it's definitely not the typical mindset of people who are in the military. He wrote that the most important leadership value for him as an officer was love for my soldiers and making them feel loved. And these are his words. I believe that from the moment they receive soldiers, a commander should make a conscious decision to love every one of the soldiers under their command without exceptions. Loving your soldiers is like a muscle, and if you use it enough, you'll be able to love them all. I plan to do exactly that with my platoon. Even if you're mad at a soldier, disappointed, or need to punish them, the soldier should always feel that you, their commander, cares for them. By loving our soldiers and making them feel loved, we'll automatically make them better soldiers and fighters. So I said, for Yanai, this didn't stay as empty words, something that you write on the wall, but live a different kind of ethos. He lived by that word, by those words. And I want to give you just a couple of short examples. So first of all, it's very difficult to love someone that you don't know. We're all individuals, and what it means for one person to feel connection and to feel love is very different than what it means for the next person. And you can't be exact, you can't be accurate with how you approach someone and how you show them that kind of caring and love unless you know them as individuals. And the army is not great with individualism. Everyone has to wear the same uniform and do the same things, and there isn't a lot of time allocated for getting to know one another. The schedule's usually very busy from morning to night. You don't have a lot of time for interpersonal interaction. And Yanai didn't accept that. He said, no, this is what I believe in, and so I'm going to find the time. And he actually told us that he'd found the perfect solution. As new recruits in the army, one of the things they have to do a lot of is guard duty, especially at night, and it's usually something that they don't like because everyone's tired, and who wants to wake up at 3 a.m. and stand guard duty for 2 hours. And Yanai told us that speaking to them during that time was the perfect solution because it basically had two objectives. One, it helped them pass the time. It made it a little easier for them to get through those long hours of guard duty. And second, there were no distractions. It was the perfect time for him to sit down and have a really deep conversation with his trainees and get to know them so he could find the way to make those connections with them that he believed in. One of his trainees, when he was an officer, Her mother also came to visit us during the Shiva, and she told us that about 2 weeks before he was killed, her daughter had been doing guard duty for the first time. She was a new recruit, and she was standing at 3 o'clock in the morning in the dark and the cold. And all of a sudden, she said, was like God showed up, because she's a new recruit and she sees an officer coming. And this is a hierarchical organization. So she stands at attention and salutes and says, "Attention, platoon commander." And he sat down with her and just chatted, asked her about her family, her hobbies, her passions, how she was doing so far in basic training. And she told her mom that at some point she felt like he'd kind of run out of questions, because he asked her a very strange question. He asked her if she'd set goals for herself for the year. And she she told her mother she felt kind of uncomfortable because she didn't want to remind him that she was a new recruit. She doesn't have any goals. She just follows orders. That's her job. And she told him that. And he said, no, everyone needs to have personal goals. And I'd like you to think about it. And I'd like you to think what your goals are. And if you feel comfortable, you can share them with me, and I'll try and help you achieve your goals. Her mother was flabbergasted. She said she felt like the army had really changed since she was in the army. It wasn't the army, it was Yanai and his ideas. But that's really how he functioned and what he believed in. A lot of times we ask, how do you build the muscle of love? How do you work on that, building those connections? Another example is that a trainee who was Yanai's trainee before he became an officer came to meet with us, and he told us the following story. He's a young man. He's part of the Druze minority in Israel. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Druze minority, but they're an offshoot of Islam. They're Arabic speaking, but they serve in the army. The men, at least, serve in the army, like Israelis. And this young man was part of that group. And he told us that he came to basic training, and it was really tough for him because Hebrew was not his native language. It was rather Arabic. And culturally, he wasn't used to being in the mainstream Israeli culture because he'd grown up in a more closed off village. And he told us that after a day or so in basic training, they split all the trainees up into different groups, that there's like set companies that they'd be in for the rest of their service. And he saw all of his friends going one way and him being sent to another company. And he refused to go. Now, this is the military. You can't just say, you're not cooperating. It doesn't work like that. It's not camp. And so they sent him to the side, and he said for a few hours, there were a bunch of officers were coming up to him and giving him all kinds of ultimatums. If you don't join the company you were assigned to, you're going to be court-martialed for insubordination. You're going to be sent to military prison. We're going to throw you out of the unit. And he stood his ground and refused to move. And he said, then Yanai showed up. And after 7 minutes, I went with him. And we asked him what happened in those 7 minutes. And he said, Yanai called him and said, the guy's name is Aimal. He said, Aimal, come sit down. My name's Yanai Kaminka, not commander, not sergeant. And I want to know, what are you concerned about? What are you worried about? He said he felt like someone saw him, and he felt confident to follow Yanai and that he would be seen. He told us a lot of stories about basic training, including another time that he had a hard time understanding a lesson, and he'd kind of left, basically gone AWOL, even though he was in the base, and everyone was looking for him, and he stayed in his room. And at some point, Yanai came in, and he told Yanai where he was. And Yanai, again, didn't yell at him, didn't get angry. He asked him, Aimal, what's going on? What's going on in your mind? Like, how could you, why are you not with the group? And he said to Yanai, I don't understand, and the Hebrew's too hard for me, and I can't follow what's going on. And Yanai said, okay, you don't understand. I'm going to sit with you, and I'm going to explain it to you. And he sat with him, reviewed all the material, sent him back to his unit, and the Aimal said he was sure he was going to be punished for disappearing. He said nothing happened. Yanai somehow arranged it. And that's how it went throughout the duration of his training. The end of the story is that Aimal, who started out his army service being threatened with a court-martial for insubordination, this summer finished officers training himself. He's now an officer in the IDF. And that shows the power of seeing another person and what it can give another person when you truly see them. I'm just running through some other things because we don't have a lot of time. The second value that Yanai wrote in officer's course was responsibility. Again, these are his words. He wrote, "Every person in the platoon, every event that happens is my absolute responsibility. Whether it's something that happens on base or something that happens at home, I take full responsibility for it all." I can tell you that reading this to you now it really sends shockwaves through me, because since October 7th, as Israelis, we've heard a lot from our leadership about how they're not responsible for what happened, and they don't want to have an inquiry, and they don't want to find out, and then everyone's busy blaming somebody else. I haven't heard any of the leaders on a national level take responsibility and use this kind of deep responsibility that Yanai took upon himself at age 20. But for him, when he wrote it, he also did it. And, just very briefly, one of the ways that he showed that kind of responsibility is that in those same nighttime discussions that he would have with his soldiers when they were on guard duty, he wouldn't only try to learn about them as people and their personality traits, he would also try and find out what their life situation was, who had trouble at home, who had special needs at home, anything that might be relevant to their state of mind. And a lot of weekends, he would come home on weekends and do home visits with his recruits. And he would come back with detailed lists of what was going on, what the situation was at that recruit's home. One time he came back and said, this recruit isn't eligible for extra payments because her dad earns over a certain amount, but the family actually has a lot of debt, and these are what their expenses are. And he'd made a detailed list of all their monthly expenses and how, although the father had a reasonable salary, they weren't able to make ends meet. We also heard about that a lot because we have a family group, an extended family, and Yanai would often send messages, "I'm looking for a washing machine. I'm looking for a cell phone. I'm looking for a sofa that opens into a bed." And it was all different requests from the soldiers that he saw that they needed on these home visits. And the army has army social workers, but in his mind, it wasn't something he could push off to the social worker. He would work with the social workers, but it was his responsibility to make sure that his soldiers got everything they needed and had everything they needed. And it wasn't responsibility that he pushed onto anybody else. So I'm just going to move ahead. The last thing to tell about Yanai is that in the army, it's very customary that at different points in your army service, at an ending ceremony or at the end of a march, the whole unit will stand together and the commanders will come in front of everybody else and say, you did an amazing job. You really stood out in the last activity, and I'm going to give you my beret, or I'm going to give you a pin, or something of their own, something personal they give to a soldier who really stood out. And Yanai refused to do that, even though everyone in the army does. He said, "I'm not going to do that because the person that I give something to feels great. They're going to feel on top of the world. But everyone else around them is going to feel like they gave it their all and no one noticed, that they worked really hard and no one saw." And he said, in my group, everybody in my squad first, and then later in his platoon when he was an officer, every person is worthy. And that meant when he was a squad commander, he had 12 people in his squad. Every night for 12 nights, he woke one of them up, each time a different one, did some kind of physical activity with them, and then gave them something from him. But each one of them got it. It wasn't something that one got preference over the other. He did that as a squad commander, gave them each unit tags, each with something personal that he'd written to them on the back. This is one example that he'd written to one of his trainees. He wrote, "When we uncover the light of others, our own path becomes clear." And then you can see at the bottom, it says YK and I Kaminka to LB. One of the last videos we have of him is the week before he was killed. His new recruits had their swearing in ceremony. And one of the parents took a video of him standing in front of his platoon. And he said, "Platoon 3, I'm very proud of you. You've done an amazing job. And you'll get something from me, but it won't be like this in front of everybody. It'll be in a different way." And he apparently planned to give each one of his 30-something new recruits something personal from him in a one-on-one experience that they each would feel worthy and each would feel seen. He unfortunately didn't have the time to do that. I want to end this portion before I speak briefly about myself by reading you a poem that my husband wrote. My husband is a poet, and he wrote a lot of poetry leading up to October 7th. Yanai was a very harsh literary critic. He would often read the poems and say to my husband, "Dad, this poem sucks. It's really not very good." But there were a few that he liked. And specifically the poem that I want to read to you that was written for him during the year that he was in his civilian service. He had a tough year. He experienced something that I think most of us have experienced at some point in our life, that he was a very good friend to others, but he wasn't a very good friend to himself. He was very critical of himself. And we as parents felt that he had a lot of darkness surrounding him, a lot of personal darkness. And we live in an age of toxic positivity where we're all taught to, darkness is no good and we have to only say good things and only be happy all the time and make nice posts on social media. And we wanted to speak out against, my husband wanted to speak out against that tendency and tell Yana, it's okay. It's okay to be in the darkness, in your own darkness, and don't be afraid of it. Don't be so focused on chasing away your darkness. Be willing to be inside your darkness, to hear it, to be in it, and maybe while you're in the darkness, you'll also find some light. It was right around this time of year, right before Hanukkah. And in Hanukkah, there's a lot of discussion of darkness and light. And he wrote the following poem. I'll read you the translation. It was written in Hebrew, and the Hebrew, of course, is much, much better than the translation because it's very difficult to translate poetry. So my apologies for the translation that doesn't do justice to the original. But basically what my husband Eyal was trying to tell Yanai is, don't be afraid of the darkness. Everyone has darkness within them. And be willing to just be in it until you can find the points of light. The poem goes like this. We come to the darkness. Hark ye darkness, we come with a caress. We come to touch you, to hear your voice. We come so you can lean on us when nothing makes sense, to meet you in your world. We'll lend an ear as your image darkens, hunches toward us, shrouded in night. We won't drive it away. With an intrepid eye, we'll examine it anew to find the light. Our hearts are different, as the darkness will attest. Our blood flows through the annals of our nation. Yet every being has both day and night, shows the axis of our world's rotation. We'll extend our hands, we'll take yours and ours, we'll face the sounds reverberating in our song's bars. The cold will envelop us, and we'll huddle close reminded. Only at night do you see the stars. And I really liked this poem, and the last line, only at night do you see the stars, became his personal motto. He read the poem to his friends in his civilian service, to his recruits, and he used that last sentence many, many times throughout his service. This picture is a picture of the wall in his unit. Each platoon had a wall that they could paint and decorate as they saw fit. And he told the commanders who worked under him, listen, you guys can choose everything. You can decide everything, how it's going to be designed. I'm just making a decision about one thing, and it's our platoon's motto, and it's going to be only at night do you see the stars. And that's what it says on the wall. Rak balayla roim kochavim. Only at night do you see the stars. After Yanai was killed, a lot of his friends took that motto with them. This is a friend of his, and several of his friends had it tattooed on them. This is actually Yanai's handwriting, something he'd written to this friend with that sentence, only at night do you see the stars, and the friend had it tattooed on his arm to remember Yanai. That idea of seeing the other, even in times of darkness and times of difficulty, was very strong in Yanai's ethos. I showed you screenshots earlier of the battle. Yanai wrote very infrequently during the battle, but at 7:20, when he was in the middle of fighting terrorists at the base looking over the sea with Ariel, he wrote, "Whoever isn't doing anything, go calm the soldiers down." Because in the middle of this battle, he's involved in shooting. His life is in danger. What he had in his mind was not only how do I survive, but also thinking how his new recruits are feeling, how his soldiers are feeling. It's the thought of a parent, that you're not only thinking about your child's physical survival, you're also thinking about their well-being, the PTSD they're going to have afterwards. And he was able in this most extreme situation to think of himself, think of someone outside of himself and see where other people were and connect to that, even in a very, very difficult circumstance. And I want to take that example to very briefly share a bit with you of what my husband and I have been involved in since we lost Yanai. We live in a place called Tzur Odessa, which is outside of Jerusalem. It's right on the Green Line. So the Green Line is the line that divided Israel from Jordan until 1967. And since 1967, it divides Israel proper and the West Bank. And the town we live in is in Israel proper, but it's right on the Green Line. And since we moved there in 2000, it's a small place. And so we've always been very involved in the community with the mindset that what you give is what you get back. And that if we're involved in the community and we give of ourselves and join things and invest in the community, we'll have a better life living in that community. And it also means being good neighbors to the people you live with. For us, being a good neighbor is not only for the people who actually live within Tzur Odessa, but it was also being a good neighbor to the people who live immediately on the other side of the Green Line, about 200 yards away from the last house in Tzur Odessa is a Palestinian village called Wadi Fukin. Palestinian, that means not Palestinian Israelis, not Israeli citizens, but Palestinians who they live in the West Bank, even though again the distance is minuscule between us and them. And from the time we moved to Tzur Odessa, on a very local level, we were very involved in just trying to be good neighbors to one another, helping them out with the many, many complicated situations that they encounter on a daily basis living under a military occupation, and trying to help them solve those problems and find solutions to the challenges that they have in their life. Again, thinking that it'll be better for us to live together if we're good neighbors. And it's proved itself for the last 24 years. Tzur Odessa is one of the few places where there's no wall in between us. There was nothing until about 4 years ago, and now there's a fence, but it's an actual fence. It's not a wall. And we always had very good connections and relations with our neighbors, and tried with what was in our power to help with the many injustices that they encounter on a daily basis. After Yanai was killed, Israeli society as a whole was in shock. People were terrified that there would be more attacks and more people taken hostage, and everyone was scared. And for sure, people living in a place like where we live, where we're right on the border of the West Bank, people were even more afraid. My daughter, who was 16 during that first week, came into bed with us one night and said, Mom, Dad, what do we do if Hamas comes in our house? Where do we go? That was the level of fear. But as we were sitting Shiva, for the first couple days, I didn't even look at my phone. But as I started looking, I looked in the group that we have, the local group with people from Tzur Adasa, where I live, and the Palestinians in the close by villages. And I saw tons of messages in the group. And what I saw was that the Palestinians in the group were also desperately afraid. They hadn't been involved in the attack. They hadn't been involved. They're not Hamas members. They're not even in Gaza. They're in a different place. But they were terrified that there would be retribution taken on them by either settlers or by the army. They were under absolute lockdown. They couldn't even leave their village. So, and it's a tiny village. There's hardly any, they do their shopping in other places. So they were running out of supplies. There was a woman there in her 9th month of pregnancy who was worried she wouldn't be able to get to the hospital, people who needed medical treatment, just a lot of fear and suffering. And I felt like I had lost control of everything in my life at that point. And I felt like I had to at least say something. I had to do something in that situation. And I wrote my neighbors the following letter. To my dear friends and neighbors in Wadi Fukin, Husan, and Batil. These are terrible days for us all. I'm sitting Shiva for my beloved eldest son, 20-year-old Yanai Kaminka, a boy with kind eyes that saw every human being, and my heart is shattered to pieces. Within this terrible grief and bereavement, I want to say to you that I see you. I know these are terrible days for you too, days of fear and dread. I'm writing to tell you that I want only good for you, and I'm worried about you like I'm worried about us all. I wish you could be here with me during the mourning week to cry with me for Yanai, just as I wanted to cry with the Manasseh family when Ahmad was killed. Ahmad's a young man from the village who was killed by mistake by a soldier. But even though it was a mistake, he still lost his life. Ahmad, like my son Yanai, was young and beautiful with kind eyes, and I felt the pain of his parents and the entire village when he was taken. Dear neighbors, I am in pain now, deep pain, but I want to tell you that within this pain, my heart is open to you. I don't blame you for the deeds of the Hamas, and I hope that this cursed situation will somehow bring our two nations to at last learn to live together with mutual respect, so that there may be no more parents, Israeli or Palestinian, that must grieve for their sons and daughters. There is no other way. And this is the same letter a friend helped me translate it to Arabic that we sent out to all the villages. The next day, a friend from Tzur Adasa showed up at the Shiva holding 2 platters of dates. In Islamic tradition, when you come to someone who's mourning, it's customary to bring dates to the family who's in mourning. And a friend of mine from one of the villages, he couldn't leave because they were on lockdown, but he asked a Jewish friend to meet him at the gate, and he passed the dates and asked to bring them to us, to our Shiva. And I got many, many calls from friends in the villages just expressing sadness and their deep condolences on losing Yanai. I even met Ahmad's father several months later, and he just hugged me, and he was just sad about the situation. In general, our belief is that there are a lot of flavors in the Middle East, a lot of different kinds of people and different kinds of ideas, but no one's going anywhere. And we have to figure out a way to live together better than we are now. Someone once told us a sentence when I was speaking about Yanai that sounds great in Hebrew and a lot less good in English. So those of you who can read Hebrew, it's in Hebrew as well. It says, when you observe a person, he or she becomes predictable. But when you see a person, he or she becomes worthy. In Hebrew, כשצופים באדם הוא נהיה צפוי, וכשרואים אדם הוא נהיה ראוי. And we believe in that we're very good in Israel, all the different groups, whether it's Palestinians and Israelis, religious and secular. It doesn't really matter what kind of group. We're very good at observing one another, and we're all very, very, very predictable. And that if we invested a bit more, like Yanai did, in trying to see the other and understand where they're coming from, doesn't mean you have to agree or sign off on everything they say, but at least to understand their point of view, we have a much better chance of more of us becoming worthy human beings. I'll just end with one last word. People often ask me, what can I do? So I told you that Yanai didn't sleep a lot because he was busy talking to his soldiers at nighttime, and he would tell us that sleep was psychological. And we told him, Yanai, grow up, because of course you need to sleep. It's ridiculous. But he didn't listen to us. And what he did is he would drink a lot of Turkish coffee. I don't know if any of you guys have ever had the experience of Turkish coffee, but it's the coffee that's black coffee with the sludge at the bottom. And that's what Yanai liked to drink, no sugar. That's what kept him going. And at the Shiva, we asked people what was the most annoying thing about Yanai, and everyone said the same thing. He drinks a ton of coffee and he never clears his cups. He always leaves the cups with the sludge all over. We had that experience from home, and the people in his civil service and in the army shared the same experience. And when it was the 30 days after he was killed, we had a memorial at his gravesite, and instead of leaving stones as is customary on the grave, we poured hundreds of cups of Turkish coffee, and we invited everyone to have a cup of coffee and leave the sludge for Yana on his grave. Yana had a very cynical sense of humor, and we said it's a way to get back to him, for all the coffee cups he left for us to clear. We thought he would have found that funny. But more than that, we saw a lot of symbolism in Turkish coffee, and I want to invite you to take part in that symbolism. Turkish coffee is something that's accepted in many different cultures, both in the Middle East and all over the world. There's an element of hospitality in it. You invite someone into your home and serve them coffee. You invite someone to sit down and have a conversation over a cup of coffee. It's an invitation for connection. It's dark, it's bitter, there's sludge at the bottom, and real conversations are like that. It's not an ice frap. It's not a frappuccino. It's not sweet and nice and okay, everything's great. When you go deep, there's bitterness, there's sludge, and there's darkness. But those are the real conversations that we all need to have. And so I invite you to share Yanai's legacy and invite somebody who's different than you are. It doesn't have to be from a different group. It can be just someone. It can be your neighbor that you have a difficult time with or have a hard time connecting to. And start off by doing what Yanai did and just listening and hearing their pain, hearing their darkness, listening to their darkness and where they're coming from. And while being with them in their darkness, maybe finding those pinpoints of light that are the stars. And that's something that every person can do. These are just some pictures people have sent us with a coffee. I want to end by reading the end of Ariel's post, the civilian who was with Yanai on the beach. He ended his post this way. Yanai, we didn't know each other before, and we spent exactly 10 minutes together in the same space. And that was enough. That was enough to understand the material you're made of. I promise you that I will memorialize you and your ethos wherever I go, saving 20 civilians, each with an entire family. So you actually saved 20 families. And you know, Yanai, that among those 20 civilians, there is a couple, newlyweds. Thanks to you, they will build a home in Israel and raise their children. And thanks to you, 18 more people will stand one day under the marriage canopy and declare passionately that they will not forget Jerusalem. And in their hearts, they will know, we will all know, you are our Jerusalem. So that's Yanai's story. These are my 4 kids standing with Yanai when he finished officers training. And I want to thank you for listening. It's not easy over Zoom to be good listeners. So I appreciate the time. And I hope that each one of you will take that legacy forward, and that legacy of deep listening and being with another person. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Feel free, don't be shy about any questions.
I cannot see who is raising hands. Just a second. Karen, would you bring the
There's
entire group?
They're able to unmute themselves. I don't see anybody raising their hands. Oh, one. Rabbi.
Elana, could you tell us what it was like for you when your second son wanted to enlist in the army?
Sure. So you can see that Ina is standing next to my second son. They're less than 2 years apart. My second son, Liam, was he did, like Ina, he did a year of civilian service before the army. So on October 7th, he just completed his civilian service and was waiting to be drafted. But a lot of his friends who hadn't done the year of civilian service had already joined the army many months earlier. And he actually lost one of his closest friends on October 7th as well, in addition to his brother. So during the whole Shiva, he split his time between being at home with us and being with his close friend. And his draft date was 6 weeks after October 7th. It was, of course, he was already placed as a military paramedic, that's what he was going to do in his army service. And he told us that it was still very important for him to serve. I would say that overall, our feeling as parents has really changed regarding military service, because I left the United States and came to Israel at age 18 to serve in the army. It was very important to me, and I served as a lone soldier. My husband was an officer in the army, and we raised our children with the viewpoint that service was the way to give back to your community, that it was an important value. But I can't tell you that sense that there's been a change in our feeling, because in the last 2 years, we've really lost confidence in the decision makers who are making the army's a tool. So the people who are making the decisions on how to use the army, I have very little confidence in them at this point, unfortunately. When I served, I felt like the army was being used for purposes of protecting civilians, for things that aligned with my values. And it's not an absolute, it's not a black and white. Of course, the army's also doing those things today, but my confidence in the decision makers has plummeted, and it makes it much more difficult for me as my children serve. My daughter's also finishing high school, and she'll be serving soon, and my youngest as well. And it's definitely a problem because we simply don't feel that sense of confidence in our leadership, and that they're doing the right things that are going to help Israel flourish and even be able to function on a feasible level in the long term.
If I may ask, because of the events, did you change from a private citizen to a person more involved in public affairs?
Yes.
I think I think both of us, both my husband and I, have always been active socially and on the community level. To a certain degree, bereaved parents in Israel have the privilege of speaking their minds more than other people. And we've tried to use that privilege, not one that I would recommend, but it's one that we have to at least try and promote the values that we believe in, because there's a lot of people who are screaming about a lot of things that we don't believe in. So if we're able to at least share our thoughts and our values because of our status as bereaved parents, we try to do that. I joined a group, we joined a group called the Palestinian Israeli Bereaved Families Forum, which is an amazing organization. It's about 800 families, half Palestinian, half Israeli, who've all lost close family members in the conflict and are committed to peace, to reconciliation, to listening to another and understanding each other's perspectives. And I wasn't a part of that group beforehand because unfortunately I only became eligible after October 7th. Not, unfortunately, that I am eligible. It's the one organization that always says it doesn't want to grow, doesn't want any new members. But I've met some truly amazing and inspiring people through that organization, both Palestinians and Israelis, who are willing to speak out and talk about how the circle of violence is endless. And unless we break that circle of violence, that we'll never get out of this. And we all want to see a different future for our children. And it's been extremely significant for me to be part of that group. They have a lot of videos and stuff on YouTube if people are interested in learning more about them.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Question or comment from anybody?
Can also ask personal questions. No, don't be shy.
Oh, oh, sorry. Whoever's whoever's going to speak.
Okay. Elana, what gives you the strength to go on, and thank you so much for sharing your inspiring and heart-wrenching story with us, and that actually gives also hope, but how do you do it?
Thanks. First of all, hi Jerry. Not there, we've had a lot of amazing people who've been we call them personal angels. And I think what we've gone through has shown us the power of community and how important it is to have a community around you and people who literally took care of us for the first few months. So that's been a big part of the process. And also the guys you see on our screen, my other 3 children. The idea that you can't, that the people who are the decision makers today aren't making good decisions for their future, and we can't abandon ship to those people to make the wrong decisions, and we have to keep fighting for our truth and our beliefs, even if at this point we don't feel like we have a lot of chance of succeeding. I quoted to my kids, I don't know if all of you read in high school, To Kill a Mockingbird. And there's a quote there where Atticus says to the kids that he wanted them to know that real courage is not a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you're licked, but you go out and try anyways and see it through. And that's where we are now. I don't think we have a lot of chance of succeeding, but we're doing our best because we don't have any other, the alternative is too awful for our other kids.
There is a comment in the chat. Thank you for your courageous and inspiring presentation. And if there are no more questions, let's hear from Rabbi Sharon, the visit to Israel.
Thank you. Lana, first, I want to thank you for sharing the story of your beautiful son, Yanai, and Zikrono Levrach. May his memory always be a blessing. We will carry his story with us here in the States as well. I can't understand the strength you have is to share your story and to carry on his memory in such a beautiful way. I really appreciate you sharing. We just returned from a unbelievable trip to Israel last Monday. We had a wonderful volunteer mission. I brought 17 people from Park Synagogue, and we had just such a moving time. We heard many stories like yours of people that just really opened up to us. So first of all, we started our first day with a wonderful visit to Hod V'Hadar. And we love seeing your building and hearing the story of your congregation. And they prepared a beautiful lunch for us, and we really got to meet the people that we've been meeting on Zoom in person, give you all a hug. So we really had a wonderful time. I know I've already joined as an overseas member. I think other people in my group are going to do so as well. We want to keep up the relationship. It really was special. We also visited the Fuchsberg Center in Jerusalem, Fuchsberg Center for Conservative Judaism, on Shabbat. And so we had a lot of nice experiences with our conservative community in Israel. And when we went to Hostage Square, there happened to be like a singing circle, and they said, wait, we're conservative Jews too. And it was us. They were a group from the youth movement. We met someone from Hanatone, and so we kind of sat and sang together. And it was just felt like we, found our people in Israel. It was very nice. We felt connected. The rest of our group, I really think the rest of the trip had 3 different components: volunteering, bearing witness, and meeting and supporting Israelis. So we just had some wonderful experiences. we volunteered every day for a number of hours. So we picked avocados in the Gaza envelope at Kibbutz Kisufim. We cooked for about 5 hours in a kitchen in Rishon LeZion, making 100+ meals for soldiers and families in need. We packaged vegetables near you at Moshav Beratayim, and we volunteered at Leket, sorting vegetables. We made packages for soldiers in Jerusalem, a can of soda, and we had like a salty treat and a sweet treat and a personal note that was being taken down to them for Shabbat. So we just had some wonderful experiences of giving back. We, as we said, we bore witness. We went to Hostage Square, we went to the Site Nova Festival. We went to Techem and saw the cars. We just had unbelievable experiences. And I felt like it was, when we go to places and see different places, countries, and you see a Holocaust memorial, and you're there after, you know, it's been kind of established as a museum, we felt everything was so raw. We felt like we were at the sites before the government came in and made a museum. We could see, you know, we were there, and we were very conspicuous, as I mentioned. We were the only, except for the bus of rabbis, we were the only Americans we ever saw. So when we got to a place, there were buses, but it was soldiers. We saw people finishing basic training. We saw soldiers in their leadership courses, you know, their training to become like Yanai, to become commanders. We saw buses of Israelis coming to these sites, but we were the only Americans. And wherever we went, people would come up to us. And that's when we heard people's stories. People would come up and say, "Where are you from?" We're like, "From the United States." And they would say, "What are you doing here?" We tell them, and they say, "Thank you, thank you." And we were hugging people we had just met for the first time. We heard people's stories. A tour guide who was a survivor from the Nova Festival, how he got his friends out in his car by driving, you know, over the sand dunes. We heard families who have, so most of our guides and anyone we met, they had served in Miluim. They had children who were serving in the army. We heard everyone's stories of where their family was, 4 or 5 kids in every direction, and where they were on October 7th. And we also, in our hotel in Jerusalem, we realized there were many, we were walking down the stairs, and we see there's like riding toys and high chairs in the hallway. And we realized there's families from the Lebanese border. I talked to a woman, very religious, who would say they were from like a mile from the Lebanese border. They've been living in the hotel for over a year. And so we connected with them, and their kids were running down the hall, and what are you doing here? You know, again, tell our story. It was really a very powerful and meaningful trip. The people on the trip were all, I'd say, from mid-40s to mid-70s. We weren't youngsters. You know, anyone can go and help out and bear witness. And so I encourage anyone who has a chance to go to Israel. I wish I could go back next week. I'm hoping to go back in the spring, maybe bring another mission. But it was really, I have been to Israel at least 15 or 16 times. I was trying to count. I lost count. I lived in Jerusalem for 2 years in school. I never had an experience like this. It was really an unbelievable experience, really feeling Am Yisrael being part of the Jewish people, that we just connected on such a different level. And we were all very proud to be there and to bring your stories home to our congregation. There are a number of people on the call. There were some of the women that were on our trip. I saw Jackie and Becky and Sandy and Miriam were all part of my mission. I know they'll all join these calls in the future because we feel this really connection, this sisterhood with you in Hod V'Hadar. So thank you for making us part of your family. You are part of our family, and hope to see you again soon on your end of the pond, we should say. Over there. So again, thank you, Elana, for sharing your story.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm also looking at the chat, and there are several messages. It says, Elana, thank you so much for sharing your nice story and your thoughts. Okay, again, some other one is jumping. Elana, you are so real open, articulate, and you have touched our hearts and soul with your wisdom. Okay, again, it's jumping. Okay. First of all, dear Elana, what a wonderful, courageous, and inspiring presentation. Yana is always in our hearts. even more fully with all those lovely stories of his army service and before. Indeed, a full person in such a kind eyes. Eyal's poem is stunning, even in English translation. Only at night do we see the stars. Much love, Mike and Susan. Okay, many people are writing and it's jumping. The chat is jumping. Let's conclude with a prayer sung by Rabbi Helaine. So let's put the prayer on.
I chose this memorial prayer. The El Male Rachamim was adapted by two women rabbis. For Yizkor this past Pesach. I just am going to sing part of it, and then I'd like to read the rest in English and conclude again in the Hebrew and music. El male rachamim, ba'olam shelo hayu bo rachamim. Amtsei menucha adina, tachat kanfei hashchina, b'ma'alot hanishbarot shel zohar ha'adam. El male rachamim, God of compassion in a universe that lacked compassion. Grant tender rest beneath the wings of the Shekhinah in the broken spheres of human radiance. To the souls of each and every of the injured and the violated in the horrors of the pogrom of October 7th. For the fear that fell upon each man and woman, elders, youth, and children. Our mouths do not know how to scream or put it into words. For we lament and mourn for them, for us. Because of this, our hearts are faint. Because of these, our eyes grow dim. Woe to us, for we are broken. Woe, for our homes were shattered, our souls and bodies tormented, and our faces darkened. Therefore, compassionate one, reveal our torment to the world and for all time. And from one end of the earth to the other, may the silent voices utter, guard our souls in the land of life, for life is our heritage. May we come in peace to healing. Please, God, heal all the injured. Please, God, heal the families and caretakers. Please, God, hear and heal us all. El narifana la lenifkaot velanifkaim. El narifana la mishpachot velametaplim. El narifana lanu kulanu benomar. Amen. And together we say, Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Helaine. I would like to thank all participants, especially Ms. Elana Kaminka, and we hope to get together again in March or April. We'll talk to the committee and we'll make some decisions. And thank you all, and shalom.